your life with Jean Wolfe?
Yes. When I came over here to get a teaching job, I was hired, and I had looked and looked and looked to see where I could stay. Well, the superintendent's office had sent me different places where they were taking boarders or roomers. I first stayed at the old Crown Zellerback hotel that used to be there, and so I stayed there my first night when I got into town, then called different places, and every place that I called that the superintendent's office had given me the people, they were all filled. And so then I came to find out that they were all filled by the same person. I thought, how are they going to stay at each one of these places? So when I called Mrs. Hawkins, I told her, and she said, well, this Marion Locker had said that she wanted that place. Well, what Marion had done was be sure that she had a place to stay of her choosing. And so Mrs. Hawkins said, well, you're here, so you can stay here.
So Marion Locker had reserved all those places.
Mm-hmm.
That was
she was from around Klamath Falls, I think, but she wanted to make sure she had
yeah, but what about the rest of the world?
Anyway, so I stayed with Marion Locker and Dorothy Wallace, who was a good friend of Aunt Bertha's daughters. Went to the same grade school, White Settlement, that Marjorie and Dorothy Wallace had gone to school together. And so Dorothy called me during the summer before I went over to West Lynn and said she was going to be teaching there, and would I agree to rooming together? And so I wrote back and said, well, when I find a place, if you come, we'll see what the situation is. And so we did. We shared. Mrs. Hogan had 2 bedrooms downstairs. One was the master bedroom, and one was a smaller room. And so when we got there, I was talking to Mrs. Hogan. Anyway, Dorothy and I ended up in the big bedroom. We slept together, room together. And then Marion had the smaller room, Marion Locker, who had reserved places all over. Anyway, so the 3 of us girls lived there with Mrs. Hogan's. And so I think maybe the first year, I can't remember, and then Dorothy and we had become good friends to Marjorie Sinclair, who was an English teacher at the high school. And I don't remember how we first met her, but through the teachers' meetings and things we did. But anyway, so after the first year, Marjorie Sinclair, who was Cleo's wife, Cleo Wolfe's wife, Jean's brother. Anyway, so Marjorie and Dorothy found a place to live together. And then Marion, I don't know where she went, and then Mrs. Hogan, I stayed there at Mrs. Hogan's. And so then she was looking for a nan or someone to help her with the yard. She was in her 70s, I think. And so she needed somebody to do heavier work. And so one time, Dan McMahon, who was a very good friend of your dad's, he knew Mrs. Hogan was taking in boarders. And so he asked her, he told her about Jean needing a place to live. Evidently, Jean, your dad, was staying at his mother's and driving to West Lynn from, where Grandma Wolfe lived. And so he came to Mrs. Hawkins, she interviewed him. Joy and Brent were there. Joy had come up. I don't know if I had told ahead or not about that trip.
No.
I was at Ontario. I'll just intersperse here to tell how Joy happened to be there. Fred and Fern were coming to Portland, and Fred said, well, I'm going at a certain time, and you can ride over with me. I wouldn't have to ride on the bus, which was stop at every little place. And so I can't remember how it came about, but anyway, Joy and Brent came with us. And so Joy and I and Mrs. Hogan and Brent were eating out in the kitchen when Jean knocked on the door. And so she was in the living room talking to Jean, and Joy and I were still in the kitchen, and we could see clear into the living room. And he was talking to Mrs. Hogan. I said something that she think he's cute or something. Anyway, so we had a little discussion about it out in the kitchen. Well, then Mrs. Hogan hired Jean. And then he took, well, in the meantime, I moved into the smaller room that Marion Locker had. It was smaller, far for one person. It was a nice, size, cute little room. And so Mrs. Hogan moved upstairs. She had a upstairs in her house, up the stairs, and she moved up there so that she could rent this room where Dorothy and I had the master bedroom, evidently, for Jean. And so he came to live there, and he helped Mrs. Hogan outside. And then we all ate together, Mrs. Hogan and I think we did the cooking. And I don't remember what Jean did, but I can remember when we were in the kitchen working, and Jean would go in the bathroom to take a bath or just go,
Do whatever he did.
do whatever he did. And he'd take the newspaper in with him, and he'd find something. He'd laugh. I never heard anybody laugh in the bathroom before. Anyway, so as we were living there, one day he was going in to see his mother. And he said, I'm going to see Mom. You want to ride along? Just, oh, sure, I'll go along. So we went in to see his mother, and after a few trips, next time he said, I'm going in there, and we just started going to see his mother. And then eventually there was one place along on McGoffin Boulevard that they played music, and we stopped, and Jean had a beer, and I don't know what I had, probably, I don't remember, anyway. So it got to be kind of a habit when we'd go in there, we'd stop at this little place, and then they were playing music, and we danced together. And this one song, it did not fit us, but the name of it that we always enjoyed dancing to, it had the nice rhythm for us, and it was called Slipping Around. Well, we weren't slipping around, we were just by view. Anyway, so when we would go on dates, I could not, because of the school rules, the teachers were not to go be seen in places like bars or wherever, because we were representative of the school, and the small children's parents might see us
Role
somewhere.
model.
Anyway, so that's how we started, and then eventually Jean moved into, maybe Mrs. Hogan asked him to, because we were kind of going back and forth to see his mom. And so I think she thought, I think I'd better have him move someplace. I don't know. And Jean never told me that Mrs. Hogan asked him to move or what. Maybe he just thought he should. Anyway, so he moved to, and I can't remember if the place was in Oregon City or where it was. But anyway, he moved over there. And then we continued dating. He'd come pick me up at Mrs. Hogan's. And anyway, so that's how we met. And
I have a question about Dan McMahon, not to go backwards, but is Dan McMahon, they were good friends. Was he the one about the bear story?
I don't remember about a bear story, but he worked down at Crown too. He had a high position down at Crown.
Oh.
Dan McMahon did. And so Jean and Dan were good friends, and Dan and Teresa like clams. Teresa was his wife. And so we went to the coast one time with Dan and Teresa, and we dug. Jean was a good clam digger, and I don't know if Dan dug any clams or not, but he was older than Jean. And so, but I remember I'd fry the clams, and then we'd have some left over, because, we dig clams and have a big plate of clams, some left over. And Dan McMahon, I think he was probably one of the first ones up, and he'd eat some of those cold clams that were in the refrigerator. And then later on, I think Dan McMahon was, after he retired from Crown, I think the government hired him. It had something to do with FBI and money or whatever. Anyway, Dan.
Treasury Department?
Well, I don't know. Jean never talked about it because he wasn't supposed to.
It was secretive.
So it was pretty secret. And then Dan wanted Jean to go in with him, but we were married and planned to have a family. And so Jean didn't want to get mixed up with government stuff. anyway, so I don't know I don't remember what happened to Dan and Teresa when they passed. I don't remember anything about them. But he was good friends. They moved to California. Maybe that was closer to Dan's work or not. And we would go stop in and see them when we were down there. And one time we were there, and Dan had the most beautiful big steaks barbecued out there. It was fun. They were nice people. And the first time I ever saw cauliflower she fixed the whole cauliflower and then had a cheese sauce she put over it. I've never seen it served like that. And so I learned to fix it like that. That was Teresa. She was a nice lady.
Did Dad like that, the cauliflower?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes. He liked cheese,
Did he like broccoli?
I don't remember what all he liked or disliked, but I know he liked that.
And the house that you lived in with Mrs. Hogan, that wasn't the house by the bridge. It was
No, it was a house that was just down a block from the high school.
Oh.
It was on Broadway, I think the house was on Broadway, and that was the street. The next street up was the high school street.
And so you and Dad lived there at the same time for how long?
I don't remember. And then he got an apartment someplace.
Enough time.
We were dating evidently, and going in to see his mom, and that kind of turned into dates. And then he left and had an apartment of his own.
Okay. And that was just for probably propriety's sake.
Well, maybe. It probably was. Yeah. I don't. Well.
She was
yes,
protecting you, maybe.
It would look better, but. I know, I think he said he just rented, I don't know whether it was I don't know whether it was a whole apartment or just a place to sleep. I don't know. And so, but anyway, I've seen once in a while when we go on a date.
And when you first started to go see his mom, do you think he had designs on you then?
Well, he's probably,
I mean, why would he ask you to go meet his mom?
Well, I think at first it was just, we were both there, and he was going to take it. Thought maybe I'd like to go for a drive, because I didn't have a car.
Oh, okay.
And so he had this Chrysler, I think it was kind of like a coupe. It was an old car.
Was it nice?
It had been his day, but it was
had
older.
Wheels, and it ran.
And it ran, yes. And then, before we got married, he traded that car and got a 40 Ford. And when he'd come to pick me up at the school, we were still dating, and he'd come and he'd meet the boys from the school, the older boys that were 7th or 8th grade, I guess. They'd go out when he'd come. And that 40 Ford had a big transmission, I guess, in it, and he could spin sitting still, and those guys just thought, oh, wow,
They liked him.
They liked him. Oh, well, I guess they did. They liked his car and what he could do.
They were impressed. And was your first alcoholic drink with Dad at one of those stops? Do you remember?
I think I had one, maybe it was with Bert and Helen when I went down to live with them after my first year of college. And so they introduced me
They were the ones that
and I think it was a Tom Collins. There's a John Collins and a Tom Collins. I think the lesser of two evils was probably the Tom Collins. I'm not sure.
Gin.
I don't
gin
remember.
drink.
I don't know. I didn't know my drinks from that those days.
And so you lived with Uncle Bert, not to backtrack, but you lived with Uncle Bert and Aunt Helen over one summer?
Part of the summer, because part of that I went down to see Grandpa and Grandma Douglas down in Chico, and I stayed with them until Daddy called and said I needed to come home and help because Grandma Hawkins was ill.
And that's when you went and flew
Yeah.
back with Bert in that plane. Yeah. So after Dad moved into the apartment, how long after that did you decide you wanted to get married?
Time goes by.
Right.
And I don't know.
But if it was maybe
it was probably within a year or so. I think probably a year that we dated.
So this is the marriage, but we have some pre-marriage pictures.
Well, this is
later on, right?
the marriage, and then the 50-year. he proposed the second time.
Oh, okay.
That was our 50th wedding anniversary on the right,
I think
and this is our wedding picture.
I think later on there's some pictures of you when you were dating, but I wanted to ask you about your wedding. Who was there? Who stood in for you?
Oh.
What were the colors? The music?
Well, my colors were what we could get at that time. Joy was my matron of honor, and she wore a light green, a real pale light green dress, formal. Eilina was my maid of honor, and she wore a light lavender gown. I loaned Clara, Jean's sister, on a formal that I had, which is light blue, and Althea had a formal that was pink. So we were most of pastel colors that we had. We couldn't afford to have each girl.
Buy a new dress.
No.
And the dress that Aunt Joy wore, that was the dress that was in the picture a few pages ago?
Yes.
She looked really pretty.
That's probably the first formal she ever had. Of course, when she got married, she was wearing a long dress of Alta's that Alta had, but it was all she could afford at the time. But she looked beautiful in
She
the
did.
pretty colors.
She looked beautiful in the picture. And did you have flowers? Did you have candles?
Well,
what time was it?
Flowers, yes. Now, Joy's neighbor, she was just down the road from Joy, and she raised beautiful flowers. And she also played the organ. So she, I don't know if she volunteered or Joy paid her, I don't know. I was such in the middle of a lot of things at that time. But she brought flowers, and we had baskets of flowers around at the wedding. You can see in the wedding picture there were flowers there. And the candles.
Because it was what time?
I think we bought the candles.
It was at night? The wedding
It was at 8 o'clock in the evening, but in Eastern Oregon, the summertime was still light.
Was it light when the wedding was over? Do you remember?
I don't know. Well, we had the reception down in the basement after, so I imagine it was dark by the time everything was finished. Yes, I know. We had the reception down there, and anyway.
What did you serve? Do you remember? Or you were
Oh,
you were over the moon.
Well, I know Daddy bought the cake, had the cake made, and we had a wedding cake.
Do you remember the flavor?
Yeah.
It was probably white. Did they have chocolate cake?
I don't know, and I don't remember. It was
Big
as far as I
blur.
go, it was a wedding cake, and I don't remember the flavor.
And the dress and the veil, where did
Oh,
they come from?
that dress was my dress. Uncle Fred and Aunt Fern bought that for me here in Portland. But I borrowed Aunt Helen's veil that she had had. Althea had also used Helen's veil, and Althea had Helen's dress, wedding dress too. So, of course, they were just got married right out, of course, out of high school. So they didn't have any money for dresses either.
And
But
your dress is where? The wedding dress, did you save it?
oh, I have it. It's in my trunk downstairs.
And Dad had who stand up for him?
That was Bert Elledge.
That was his
That was
husband.
best friend, yes. And then Bert and Althea's husband, Jim, and I think Harold Trinkle, and
Oh, Alfie.
Eileena's brother-in-law was
Oh.
the groomsman.
And how did you know him? Just
Who?
or Eileena's brother-in-law.
Oh, well, his wife was Althea's best friend too.
Oh, okay.
As same as like Eilina was mine. Those two girls were best friends.
And did you
Keith
have-
Kendall was his name.
What was his
Of course,
name?
they're both gone.
Oh.
Keith Kendall. Both of them are gone now.
You remember? Did you keep in touch with them as you got older?
Well, through Eilina, I'd see them, yes.
And did you have music?
Well, of course. Of course, Fred sang at my wedding. He sang the Lord's Prayer. Another one was "Oh, Promise Me." And I can't remember the other one or whatever. But yes, he sang. And David recorded it. Because David had, when the platters first came out, they were kind of not thick plastic. Well, earlier, Dad had some platters that were old, and they were quite thick. I think you and Colleen found some of those that weren't exactly
Don't do it.
music for children.
No, they were not.
But these platters were quite thin, and when I played our wedding recording, it was, I had to put a spool on top of the record right in the middle there to hold it down. Otherwise, it was kind of.
But you still have it?
Oh yes, it's down. I think it's in my trunk with our other wedding things. I tried to put it in there.
We need to have that put on some sort of another recording.
And then I have some smaller. They had this smaller little records that when my family sent a letter to me, everybody was there at something, and they passed it around so everybody could say something to me, which is there too. Which is
About
nice.
the wedding, or when you
No,
were in college?
just when I was in college and maybe even when I was staying at Mrs. Hawkins, I don't remember. But I have one or two of those little ones, and then I have the larger one of our wedding. It's on there.
And how many do you think he sent in total? But you have two left. But how
Two
many
what left?
of the little recordings when you were in college, or when you were
Oh,
with the
I think
family?
I don't think there's more than two.
That's wow. That had to
That
be
was when
touching.
the
Yeah.
record players were first coming out, and David bought the platters. They were pretty.
It was a big deal.
Well, it was a big deal in those days to have it recorded.
And then where did Mrs. Hogan have a player that you could
No,
hear?
I did. I was going to dancing, and I had a record player, just a portable one that I would pack around.
Was it the one that you had?
You kids remember, it was just
Yeah.
a little, like a suitcase type
Yeah.
thing.
Was it black or red?
It was red. It was a deep red, not
Yeah.
bright red, just a deep kind of.
What happened to that?
Oh, I think we
I know.
had to get rid of some things. I think it went by the wayside.
So after the wedding, did you go to the apartment that Dad had moved to after?
No, Dad arranged to have an apartment for us. It was right close to the hospital, and that you kids, well, anyways, close to the hospital, and there was a lady that owned the apartment. It was just below the old Oregon City Hospital, and so Dad rented a place there. He and Bert Elledge found the place and moved all of our wedding gifts into that apartment. So when we came back from our honeymoon, why, they had all the stuff in there. But they had stuffed all of our pots and pans with wadded up newspaper. They had a mouse trap on it was a pull down light switch, and they put a mouse trap on that. They had bells on the springs of the mattress. And, well, it was just like they used to do that for people. In our day, they gave them a chivalry, but this was not a chivalry. It was just, they fixed up our apartment for when you got back.
What's the difference between a chivalry and what they did to your apartment?
Well, chivalry, everybody came, to, I don't, well, I'd never had a chivalry, but I'd been to some. They fixed up, there was a group of them came to welcome them back from their honeymoon, I think, as I recall.
So it's a welcome back party.
Yes.
And so you didn't stay there that night.
Didn't stay where?
At that apartment that night after the wedding.
No, we were on a honeymoon. We went to Yellowstone National Park for a honeymoon.
Immediately after the reception, or did you stay?
Oh, yes. Well, we took off. Well, Gene wanted to stay that first night because it was late. He thought he could get a nice room in Boise because it was a large town. Well, and some of the young people had put rocks in our hubcaps, and so it was rattling, banging, and somebody stopped or went past Gene and said, pointed to it, he said, "Hey, you've got your lug bolts are loose in there." And Gene said, "Yeah, I know," but it was rocks that somebody put in there. Anyway, he could not find a room in Boise. They were having some kind of convention, probably was a cattleman's convention, I don't know. But there was not a room to be found. So Gene was so embarrassed that he hadn't ordered it beforehand. So anyway, we had to go back to Nantha and get a room The only thing you could find was upstairs above some kind of a store or whatever it was, and the blinking lights around. But anyway, well, yeah, you do what you have to do.
Yeah.
So that was the first night. And the next day, we went out to go to breakfast, I think. And we walked by a store, and they had a blouse in that store that was like made out of a newspaper. And it was kind of unique. And he bought that. The first thing he bought for me after he got married was that blouse. It looked like a newspaper print.
Right.
It was cut out of that.
And that was in Nampa? Or that was in
That was
Boston?
in Nampa.
And then you went on to...
Well, I think we went to, I don't know where next, but I know we went through American Falls, which is on the way, and then we got up. I don't remember much else about any of the trip going. Anyway, we got up and got to see Old Faithful and went around to see the park, and then we were getting low on money, I guess,
Yeah.
and we came home.
What do you remember, other than being probably an otherworldly experience with the wedding, do you remember anything particular that was important that you felt that, I mean, seeing Dad as you're coming up the aisle, your father taking you down the aisle, any of that, does that?
Oh, it was, well, in the dressing room. Now, Brent was just a couple of years old, I think, and he was going to be the ring bearer.
Okay.
And Marilyn, Fred and Fern's daughter, was the flower girl. And I have the dress Marilyn gave me that Marilyn wore at our wedding. And little Brent, he was in the white suit but short pants, shoes with a button. And there was, at the rehearsal, there was nothing down the aisle, and we just rehearsed the whole ceremony. And then the day of the wedding, they had this white runner down the aisle. And when Brent came up to that, he was, he didn't want to get her dirty. So he sidled all down the aisle on the side so he didn't have to step on that white runner that was down the aisle. So cute. Well, that broke the ice, in a wedding. Everybody giggled. Anyway, it was so cute. And Marilyn had her little basket with petals in, and she was down.
She wasn't so worried about the white.
No,
Okay.
well, she followed me down.
Oh.
And anyway, so it was, to me, it was a beautiful wedding. It was and in those days, what you dream of when you don't have much is not as expensive as it gets
Right.
nowadays.
And importantly so. I mean,
Well,
it's crazy now.
The main thing was getting married, not the fol-de-rol of all the expense.
And now a lot of it is the wedding, and not so much the
It
marriage.
costs more than whatever, and some of those don't last.
Yeah, because of that. And so, do you remember Grandpa? Do you remember Grandpa taking you down the aisle? Do you remember him giving you to Dad? Do you remember any of that?
At the rehearsal, yes. My dad was such a fun guy. And so when the minister, I was on Dad's arm, and so he asked, who gives this woman whatever it says? And my dad says, I do, and how I do.
Did
That was at the rehearsal, of course.
And Dad didn't know him very well.
Well, he didn't, but I think they liked each other from the start. They were kind of, similar lives, and I think they just, they used to go hunting together. And my husband, Gene, said that my dad was more of a dad to him than his own dad. Well, his own dad had half a dozen kids,
Yeah.
I mean, a dozen
A
kids.
dozen kids.
And he couldn't be,
More than that.
like my dad had 6 children, which was half the amount that Gene was raised with. And a lot of them kind of raised themselves. The older ones helped the little ones, But they had a lovely family. I liked all their family.
But your dad was very special.
He was very, very special, yes. And
No one could
of a
compare.
very personality and wise. He was just a very wise man. He had been through a lot of hardships in his life, and he just grew with each hardship. He learned a lot, but yes, it was. I attribute my thoughts and the way I was raised to my dad. Well, of course, my mother passed away when I was 8, so I give her loving thanks for my birth, being that I was in here. But it was my dad that was instrumental in our thoughts and the way we were raised.
And she chose him. Your mom chose your dad, so
Yes,
thank her for that too.
Or vice versa.
Yeah. So then you moved back to an apartment that did it have Limburger cheese or just the bounce traps on the?
What apartment are you talking about?
After the wedding, after you got back from your honeymoon.
Oh,
then-
we moved into this apartment, was up by the old Oregon City Hospital, just kind of below it. And, but we set up housekeeping there, and I was still teaching. And so the first thing he bought me was a desk that I could correct my things on and work on my school things that I was teaching at the time. And so we lived there for, how long did we live there? We lived there, and then from there, we moved over to West Lynn at the house that was kind of close to Crown Zellerback. We were upstairs and had an apartment there. And there was when I got pregnant with your brother. But I didn't know at the time, my grandmother Hawkins passed away. And so I went over to her funeral. And so then while I was there, Bert said, well, if you wait for a while, he was planning to come to Portland. And he said, you can ride with me. And so I waited there, and I stayed with Bert and Helen there in the interim from my folks so we could get a start from there. And one morning I got up and went out. Well, Bert and Helen always rose early because he had to get out in the field. And so I got up. Helen was out in the shed washing, and I came out to the kitchen. They'd been up, and here was a greasy fried egg on the table. Oh dear, I didn't like the looks of that, I guess, and I went in the bathroom, and I thought, what caused that? Oh,
Did
I
Helen
was
know
pregnant with your brother. Found out I did that, and I thought, oh, okay, I think I know.
Were you overjoyed, or and when
Oh, well, of course, and your dad wanted
Yeah.
children too.
and so you were there when you realized that you were pregnant, and then you got back to West Lynn, and did you tell Dad immediately, or did you go to the hospital?
Probably
afterwards?
immediately,
Okay.
because he was overjoyed too, so. Yes, that was fun times. We didn't have much money, but we had love, and we're starting a family. But your dad, when he found out I was pregnant, he immediately turned into a father. I mean, his life changed, and he put his heels in the ground and dug in. And he was doing that many years after. And he brought himself from working at Crown to real estate, to a farmer, raising Arabian horses and registered cattle. And he was always trying to make life better for his family.
And so before you got married, did he have, because when we were growing up, he had his full-time job at the mill, but he also did a million other things to make extra money.
Actually. Well, he used to sell pots and pans when we were first married to make more money. These were waterless, stainless steel, 18/8 stainless steel cookware that was beautiful. It cost a lot. And we would go shopping, the people that hired him. They had kind of a menu that we worked from. When we'd go, before the dinner, we'd go out shopping and get our meat and all the other things we had, and put on the dinners. And then while I was cleaning up in the kitchen, Jan would give his sales pitch to the people. Sometimes, then he would get appointments to meet the different people that wanted to see the cookware. And so he would go over there, and sometimes they wanted to trade in some of their old pans on the new ones. And we got lots of Revereware cookware, which we later sent to grandchildren down to college. We gave each one of you, as you went to college, a set of luggage and I think a set of Revereware. when you went to college.
But the Revereware that we grew up with in your house was the stuff that was the trade-in on
Yes.
the water list. And before he did that, and that was like a group effort, because you would make the dinner, right? And they would watch you make the dinner with the
Well,
water list?
we both made the dinners.
Okay.
And then I did the dishes while he gave his sales spiel to the guests. See, each hostess needed to invite, I think, 6 people. There were probably 6 people in all. And so that's what he had to steal to sell why they were better than the aluminum pots that
Yeah.
some of them had, and of course we had our share.
And so, but the clients, the people you invited, they could watch you cook with this water?
No,
Oh, they
no,
could.
it
Okay,
was
they
in
just
the kitchen.
okay.
No, they didn't watch us. They were in the living room, and then when it was time, then they sat. The hostess sat them at the table. The hostess did all that stuff, got the table and placed the set and everything. So,
And before
and she got something, I can't remember what Jean gave them for hosting it.
Oh, okay.
It was a fan or something, I can't
That
remember.
makes sense. Is that when he started doing the side jobs, did he start doing that when we were kids, or did he do that before you even met him? Was he doing side
No.
jobs? Okay, so
No.
just when he became a father.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, and when we were up on the hill at the little house up there on Holcomb Road, why we were giving dinners there, because I know when your children were small, Carolyn Hunter used to babysit you kids. She lived right next door. And so she would babysit while we were giving our dinners and whatnot.
Well, you definitely had an,
That's where, no, I got your name from a girl I taught who was named Carol Ann, but I didn't want C-A-N, C-A-W, say, you know.
you thought the kids would make fun of me.
Well, I being a teacher, I knew
You'd
what
seen
children
it.
would do. And when they got calling, caw, caw, caw.
Well, I'm gonna